Hey everyone, macroeconomic objectives, low and stable rate of inflation. That's what we're going to be looking at today. Bit of a recap. Inflation refers to a sustained increase in the average price level. It's a percentage change in the consumer price index, the basket of goods. We'll look at that in a second. And we have a target in Australia of 2 to 3% per annum inflation. So the basket of goods, it is all the goods that people buy, and it's supposed to reflect the consumption habits of an average household, and they just track the price changes in goods from year to year, and the percentage change in the price is the inflation rate. There are some limitations to this measure, so this is some new stuff for year 12. There is no average household. So the stated inflation rate, the published inflation rate, is never, it's not felt the same by every household. Some households will feel it differently. So for example, we have differences in the consumer price index between income classes, right? So here we've got high income consumption here. So what's that, a Porsche, a fancy handbag, I don't know, brands, and high-end private school. So you have price rises in these products, then they will affect people with high incomes, but they won't really affect people with low incomes because they're not buying those things. So to say that inflation was 5%, so therefore the price of everything that every household buys has increased by 5%, it just isn't true, because our consumption habits vary quite a lot. There's also regional CPI differences. So consumers in the regions, they have different prices. They essentially have higher prices because think of all you see the big truck here, think of all the trucking that has to go on for people to get their goods, like even just their groceries. It costs more to get out to them, so they pay higher prices. They generally work out the CPI based on city prices because most of Australians live in the capital cities. So therefore, it doesn't really represent what's happening out in the regions. And also they're a different group of people. They buy different things. So to be stereotypical, they buy, Akubras and Dryzabone jackets, right? Now, over time, the CPI is designed to measure the change in price of goods from year to year. So to do that accurately, it's got to be the same good, right? How much was an apple in 2022 compared to how much it is in 2023? Now, that's not easy for some things because the quality of a good changes. So I've just got some photos here. This is an iPhone 12 on the left and an iPhone 13. Oh, big difference. It's got another one of these camera hole things. I don't know what that does, but it's supposed to be better. So it's not the same good from year to year. So how much of the price rise is actually due to the quality change versus due to prices just going up? The price was higher. So what was it due to, and how much of it was due to each thing? That's what the Australian Bureau of Statistics, ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that's what they want to find out, because they don't care about the quality change. They want to know how much the price has just gone up. So they try to discount the effect of the quality change. So it's quite complicated. These are smart statisticians working there. And then you see things like a service. So price of a service goes up. How do you say whether the quality of, for example, haircuts has gone up? It's pretty hard. This haircut, this photo was taken. It was £100 haircut, which is about 200 Australian dollars. So they can get expensive. Okay, and another limitation, we change our consumption due to price changes, right? So simple example, if the price of beef goes up, what are people going to do? They're going to increase demand for a substitute meat, so chicken, for example. And what that does is it changes the weightings in the CPI. So, last year you might say beef made up 1% of CPI, but now if people are buying less of it, but the price has gone up, it's hard to make that year-to-year comparison about what the average household is experiencing. So again, it's a little bit complicated. It's just a limitation of the CPI that we need to know about. We also change consumption due to new products. So these are all things that I bought when I was your age. CD player for my car, a floppy disk to put my schoolwork on, held like 3 megabytes of storage, pretty good, and a Sony Walkman. People don't buy these anymore, so the year-to-year comparisons become less relevant because we're buying different things from the year before. So how can you say the price has gone up on this thing if we're not buying it anymore, or it's a brand new good? So it makes it a little bit tricky to tell what the story is about cost of living. Okay, we do have some other measures of inflation that economists look at. They look at this one pretty closely. Underlying or core inflation. So this is a measure of inflation that excludes items with highly volatile prices. So things like oil. Oil price fluctuates quite a lot. Fruit and vegetable prices fluctuate hugely. So they're often kept out of the measure because they can spike inflation in the short term, or they can bring it down a lot. They can dip inflation a lot in the short term. So we don't want to be making big policy decisions about what to do about inflation if we know it's just going to be for a short period of time. And we've also got our producer price index, the PPI. Now, this measures the price of costs for producers. So things like wages, intermediate goods, and any other inputs. Think of things like rent for them. So what this is going to do is that's going to tell us to what's going to happen to the consumer price index, because if costs are going up for producers, we've seen this in supply and demand, costs of production will factor into the end price of a product. So this is what we call a leading indicator. It helps us say what is going to happen in the future. So very useful for economists. Okay, 2 major causes of inflation. We'll look at one here, cost push. So it's when the costs of production are increasing and that's causing prices to rise. So it's hard for people to get the terminology right. But cost push, so think of someone called cost, pushing the SRAS up, right? And we can see what happens to the average price level, right? It goes like that. And demand pull inflation. So demand pulling inflation, pulling the aggregate demand curve to the right and pushing up the average price level in that way. So we know what's going to cause these. So any things that will cause an increase in AD and any things that will cause a decrease in SRAS will do that. So we've learnt about those. Okay, costs of high inflation. We get some uncertainty. The higher inflation is, the less stable it tends to be. So if we get high inflation, it's harder to make plans about the future. So you don't know what your prices are going to be in the future. You don't know what your costs are going to be in the future. So that uncertainty leads businesses to make less investments in their business. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't want to do risky behavior like spending $1 million building a factory, right? So we're going to get less of these types of activities, like buying large capital machinery, refitting out an office. So essentially that's less economic activity, right? And that's one of the downsides of high inflation. And redistributive effects. So people get affected differently. So anyone who's on a fixed income, an income that's not increasing with inflation, they're going to be worse off because the cost of the things that they buy is increasing, but the income they receive is not. So like this guy, he's a pensioner, he's worse off. He can't buy as many goods and services as he could before. Landlords, right? They're locked into a lease. Any wages that are locked in, and any welfare recipients, they have to be approved through the government to raise welfare, raise the unemployment benefit, for example. Cash holders. So if you're one of these people who their saving strategy is stuffing money under the mattress, then that's not good, because as inflation goes up, the value of your cash goes down. That cash buys less than it used to. It's worth less now. And savers. If you're saving, even if you're saving money properly in a bank, you do need an interest rate above inflation. Otherwise, that money is still going backwards, right? So if inflation is 5% and you're getting 3% interest, yes, the amount of money you have in savings is increasing, but the cost of the things you buy is increasing by more. So it still loses value. This is a pretty big one. Could damage our export competitiveness. So these are hypothetical numbers. Let's say Australia has a 4% inflation. Japan has been historically low for a long time, 1% inflation. So what happens? The things that we sell, they're less competitive than if Japan sells the same things, because the cost of what we make is going up by more than the cost of what Japan makes. So that could hurt our exports. And our domestically produced goods are less competitive than imports from Japan, because, again, our costs are going up, but suddenly we can buy those same things that we'd make here. We can buy them cheaper from Japan, so we import more, right? So exporting less, importing more, it's not great for our economy. So that can lead to a decrease in economic growth. So decrease in exports, increase in imports. And what I've also put here is a decrease in investment, because if we're not selling as many exports, we're not selling as many domestically produced goods, we're going to back off on investing. Business owners are going to invest less, right? They're not as confident about the future. So decrease in AD, we know the consequences of that. This one, you hear about this in the news quite a bit. Price wage spiral. So as prices go up, if you're a worker, what do you want? You want a pay rise, right? You want a pay rise that at least matches inflation. Otherwise, you're worse off. We've just been through that. If your wage rise is less than inflation, you're worse off than you were before. So prices go up, wages will go up, employees will bargain for better wages. That increases the costs of production for businesses. So they might raise their prices. Raise prices again. We need higher wages. So this is what's called a price wage spiral. And this is what economists around the country are a bit worried about. That if wage rises go too far, then that inflation is just going to stick around, because we've had high inflation and they're worried that it's going to stick around for this reason. And costs of deflation. This deflation also isn't good. So decrease in AD, that's generally causing the deflation, decrease in price level. That's going to disincentivize people to consume, because if they see prices falling, they might hold off on purchases, wait for them to fall further, which is going to decrease consumption, decrease investment. Businesses aren't going to be confident. So less production, more unemployment. Oh, and guess what happens to AD with more unemployment? It goes down, so less consumption because people have less income, less production, more unemployment, and it becomes a deflationary spiral, which is arguably a lot worse because people are out of work. And it feels like this is what's happening to the economy, just going down the drain. So economists will work hard, policymakers will work hard to avoid deflation. Okay, and lastly, before I run out of time, bankruptcies. The real value of debt grows as deflation occurs. because suddenly you're receiving less income, you can't pay as much back.